The air above the Amazon moves like a slow breath, thick and warm, as if the entire forest were alive and breathing just beyond your reach. If you've ever stared into the green depth of a rainforest, you'll know the strange way it makes you feel, like standing at the threshold of a cathedral without walls, a place where time seems to have been slowed, tangled in vines, and draped in silence. But the Amazon, for all its wildness, is not the eternal untouched paradise that so many imagine. Beneath that canopy lies something more complicated, more unsettling. In the soil, beneath the roots, there are patterns, lines, circles, and squares that shouldn't be there. They suggest design, planning, intention. They whisper of a story we were never taught. And before we wander too far down these hidden roads, let me ask you, have you settled in yet? If you enjoy wandering through history in the dark with me, take a quiet second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to keep travelling these strange paths together. And since I'm speaking into your night, tell me in the comments where in the world you are and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know that someone could be lying in bed on the other side of the planet, hearing the same words under a completely different sky. This is a place that holds onto its secrets with claws. Centuries of explorers, missionaries, and scientists have tried to make sense of it, each bringing back glimpses of something vast and improbable. And yet, for much of modern history, the prevailing story has been simple. The Amazon was too hostile, too nutrient-poor, too unyielding for large civilizations to thrive. Small, scattered tribes, yes. Isolated villages, certainly. But cities, empires. That idea was dismissed as romantic nonsense, the kind of fever dream you might have if you were swatting mosquitoes while floating down a muddy river. And yet, the jungle disagrees. Recent discoveries, buried roads, mounds, canals, and strange patches of man-made earth, are telling a different tale. The signs point toward a civilization, or perhaps many civilizations, that once transformed the Amazon from edge to edge, making it a home, a garden, and perhaps even a network of megacities. It's not the kind of revelation that archaeologists make lightly. For some, it changes everything about what the pre-Columbian Americas might have looked like. For others, it's a stretch too far, a rewriting of history that risks toppling too many comfortable assumptions. Historians are still debating whether the evidence is undeniable proof or a mirage seen through the green haze of the canopy. And here's the odd thing. If you were to stand in the middle of it all today, you'd probably see nothing but forest. The Amazon is an expert at erasure. A stone temple might survive for 1,000 years in the desert, but here, wood rots, earth settles, plants invade. In a matter of decades, entire villages can vanish beneath leaves, leaving only subtle rises in the land, a slightly darker patch of soil, or an oddly straight line cutting through the trees. The jungle has perfected the art of making human history look like natural chaos. But just because it's hidden doesn't mean it isn't there. Imagine the ancient city of Cahokia in North America, its massive earth mounds rising above the Mississippi plains. Now, place something like that in the middle of a rainforest, surrounded by networks of causeways and farmland that run for miles. Imagine a civilization that didn't just survive here, it shaped the land itself. That's what the new research is hinting at, and it's forcing us to reimagine the Amazon not as a pristine wilderness, but as a landscape that once bore the fingerprints of human ambition. If you look closely enough, you start to see how the clues align. Indigenous oral histories sometimes speak of great roads, of plazas big enough for entire communities to gather, of gardens so large they could feed thousands. These stories were often brushed aside by early anthropologists as myth or exaggeration. After all, when European explorers arrived in the 16th century, they found scattered communities and seemingly untouched forest. But what if what they saw wasn't the way it had always been? What if they were walking through the aftermath of collapse? And collapse in the Amazon doesn't leave ruins, it leaves forest. A theory gaining ground among archaeologists is that the people here may have been undone by something invisible and unstoppable: disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, carried upriver long before large numbers of Europeans themselves set foot here, could have swept through these societies like wildfire. Within decades, populations could have plummeted, leaving behind empty cities for the jungle to swallow. Of course, it's still just a hypothesis. No one is claiming we've mapped an Amazonian Atlantis with certainty. The LiDAR scans and excavations are still piecemeal, and the forest remains a difficult, almost hostile place to work. But every season, More shapes emerge from the canopy's shadow, rings, rectangles, causeways that look less like quirks of erosion and more like the echoes of something organised, deliberate and human. An odd fact. Some of the most compelling evidence doesn't come from a stone ruin or an ancient artefact, but from the soil itself. This is terra preta, a rich black earth found in scattered patches across the basin, created through the deliberate mixing of charcoal, food waste and organic matter. It's so fertile that modern farmers prize it, and it doesn't occur naturally. Whoever made it wasn't just surviving, they were thinking in centuries, building farmland that could outlast them by generations. The deeper you go into this mystery, the stranger it gets. You begin to realise that the Amazon we know today may not be natural in the way we've been taught. It may be a palimpsest, an old manuscript overwritten by the passage of time, with faint words and lines from an older story still visible if you know where to look. The Amazon River begins in the Peruvian Andes as nothing more than a trickle from a glacier, before tumbling down slopes, joining streams, and gradually widening into something that dominates the continent. By the time it reaches the lowlands, it is no longer just a river. It is a moving, breathing organism, a brown, restless artery carrying the heartbeat of the rainforest toward the Atlantic. You might think of it as a single line through the wilderness, but from above, it tells a different story. It twists and bends in ways that seem whimsical, like a child's scribble, and yet some curves have a strange symmetry, an almost engineered precision. In a few places the meanders look less like natural wanderings and more like shapes designed to suit human needs. Geologists would tell you that rivers shift course all the time, carving oxbows and islands in the process. But along parts of the Amazon and its tributaries, there are traces that seem to defy that simple explanation. There are channels that run parallel for miles before meeting, or straight stretches that don't match the meander of nature. Some researchers think these could be the remains of old canals, man-made diversions meant to control water flow, irrigate fields or connect settlements. It's not an idea you hear in school textbooks, where the Amazon is treated as an untouched Eden. But when you match these unusual water shapes with nearby patches of terra preta and faint outlines of earthworks, a pattern begins to emerge. In the 16th century, the Spanish explorer Francisco de Orellana claimed to have seen bustling towns along the river's edge, each within sight of the next, linked by well-tended paths and waterways. His account described plazas, markets and farmland stretching far inland. The detail was so vivid that it bordered on the unbelievable, and for centuries scholars dismissed his writings as fantasy or exaggeration caused by illness and hardship. But modern mapping has uncovered earthworks eerily similar to what he described, suggesting that perhaps his memory wasn't so flawed after all. Historians are still debating whether Orellana's narrative was largely accurate, or whether it combined fragments of truth with embellishment. The river itself may have been central to a vast transport network. In a dense, unforgiving rainforest, cutting a road through the trees would have been laborious and constant work to keep clear. Waterways, by contrast, were highways, allowing canoes loaded with crops, pottery, and trade goods to move from one community to another. Archaeologists studying settlements along the Amazon's many tributaries have found that their placement often makes more sense when viewed as part of a riverine circuit. What looks isolated on a modern map may have been just a morning's paddle away from the next city. Oddly enough, one of the supporting clues for this hypothesis comes from fish bones. In certain archaeological sites far from the main river, scientists have found remains of large Amazonian fish species that could only have been kept alive in specially dug channels or ponds. These were likely aquaculture systems, manipulating water flow to raise and harvest fish in abundance. Such work would have required intimate knowledge of the river's seasonal rhythms, and perhaps even engineering to hold and release water at will. In modern times, satellite imagery has added a new perspective to this watery past. Seasonal flooding in the Amazon covers vast tracts of land, but when the waters recede, the patterns they leave behind can be telling. Old channels reappear as ghostly outlines, sometimes leading nowhere, sometimes linking directly to clusters of archaeological features. In the western Amazon, LiDAR mapping has traced these lines beneath the canopy, revealing what looks like deliberate shaping on a massive scale. One hypothesis is that the river and its web of tributaries were once guided by human hands in much the same way rice paddies are shaped in Asia. Not to force the water into unnatural forms, but to encourage it to serve human needs more effectively, flooding certain areas to enrich soil, feeding irrigation ditches, or creating easy navigational routes. Critics argue that the scale of such manipulation would have been nearly impossible with the tools available at the time. Supporters counter that when you have generations of knowledge, thousands of hands and centuries to work, subtle reshaping of the landscape becomes achievable, a curious off-topic fact. The Amazon River once flowed in the opposite direction, toward the Pacific Ocean, millions of years ago. Tectonic uplift from the rise of the Andes reversed its course, sending its waters east instead. It's a reminder that even the most permanent features of our planet can shift under the right pressures, and it adds a poetic echo to the idea that humans too might have influenced the river's more recent form. And if these ancient engineers did shape their watery world, what else might they have built along its edges? Some researchers think the river's course may have been flanked by long chains of settlements, not unlike the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia, each linked by trade and mutual defense. Others imagine more of a loose federation, connected through kinship and seasonal gatherings rather than formal governance. In both cases, the river isn't just scenery, it's the central spine of an entire civilization. Today, floating down the Amazon, you see endless green, the occasional fishing boat, maybe a cluster of houses on stilts. It's hard to picture this same waterway buzzing with canoes, the riverbanks crowded with people, music, smoke from cooking fires drifting into the air dot. But perhaps that's the most enduring illusion of the jungle. It hides the past so well that the present feels eternal. The truth might be that the Amazon we know is just one moment in a cycle of growth, collapse, and renewal. And so, the river remembers. Its curves and channels may be all that remain of a time when it was less a wild force of nature and more a carefully managed partner in human life. Somewhere beneath those muddy waters, the silt holds the story, waiting for the day someone will read it again. From the ground, the Amazon can seem like an unbroken wall of green, but from above, something else begins to appear. It started with hints, odd clearings, faint lines that didn't quite match the natural growth patterns of the forest. Early satellite photos in the 20th century caught glimpses of them, but the images were grainy, the details lost in shadow and cloud. Most researchers shrugged them off as logging scars, cattle pastures, or the erratic work of shifting rivers. It wasn't until the arrival of LiDAR, light detection and ranging, that the forest began to give up its shapes. LiDAR doesn't care about leaves. It sends out pulses of light from above and measures how long they take to bounce back, stripping away the canopy and the resulting maps, leaving the bare bones of the land exposed. And when archaeologists first applied it to patches of the Amazon, they saw geometry where there should have been chaos, rectangles, circles, and perfectly straight lines. Natural landscapes rarely produce such order, especially in the riotous sprawl of a rainforest. In the Brazilian state of Acre, LiDAR scans have revealed hundreds of earthworks, massive geometric enclosures, some over 300 meters across. The shapes vary, squares with rounded corners, circles linked by straight ditches, even star-shaped designs whose points radiate out like the spokes of a wheel. To create something like this, you would need organization, planning, and a coordinated workforce. Historians are still debating whether these earthworks were fortifications, ceremonial spaces, or foundations for long-vanished buildings. One of the more curious details is that many of these geoglyphs appear on higher ground, safe from seasonal flooding, and are often connected by ancient roads. Some of those roads run arrow straight for kilometers, slicing through hills and dips without deviation. Such precision is unusual in traditional footpaths, which tend to bend around obstacles. Here, the builders seem to have decided that the obstacles would bend to them instead. The presence of these earthworks challenges the old image of Amazonian peoples as small nomadic bands. You can't build and maintain massive ditches, embankments, and roads without a stable community to feed and organize the workers. You also can't do it without a reason, whether that reason was defense, ceremony, or the practical management of land and resources. Oddly enough, when researchers looked closer, they found that many of these geometric shapes align with one another across vast distances. Some point towards solstice sunrise or sunset, suggesting a possible astronomical function. Others seem to form a network, each site within a day's travel of the next. This level of connectivity hints at something more than isolated cultural flourishes. It hints at a shared system of knowledge. A strange off-topic fact. In certain regions of the Amazon, Army ants have been observed creating living bridges by linking their bodies together to cross gaps. They dismantle and rebuild these structures as needed, showing a kind of flexible collective engineering. It's an odd echo of what humans may have done here, shaping and reshaping their environment with communal effort. Critics, however, urge caution. Could some of these shapes be the result of ancient natural processes? Could parallel lines be the traces of dried river channels, their geometry exaggerated by erosion? The counterargument is that in many cases the embankments are too regular, the corners too sharp, and the placement too deliberate for nature to explain alone. When the same shapes appear dozens of times, far apart but built in the same style, coincidence becomes harder to argue. The discovery of these forms has also raised uncomfortable questions. If such large-scale construction took place in the Amazon, why isn't it better known? Why does the mainstream historical narrative still cling to the image of a sparsely populated rainforest? Part of the answer lies in the jungle's ability to hide its past. In open environments like the deserts of Egypt, ruins stand for millennia. In the Amazon, the forest swallows evidence so quickly that without modern remote sensing, you could walk right over a city and never know it. And then there's the issue of preservation. Many of these earthworks are threatened by modern agriculture and deforestation before they can be fully studied. Bulldozers erase in days what took hundreds of years to create. The irony is sharp. The very technology that lets us see these ancient shapes from space is also tracking their destruction in real time. One hypothesis gaining attention is that these geometric earthworks were part of a broader cultural landscape, an integrated system that included managed forests, engineered soils, and waterworks. Rather than scattered villages surrounded by wilderness, the pre-Columbian Amazon may have been a patchwork of interconnected semi-urban regions, each with its own central plazas, ceremonial grounds, and agricultural zones. If that's true, then the Amazon was not simply inhabited, it was curated, designed over generations to sustain large populations while blending so seamlessly into the environment that, to outsiders, it appeared untouched. The people who lived here might have understood that the forest was not an obstacle to be cleared, but a partner to be shaped. From above, the lines are undeniable. But on the ground, the forest closes in, the air thickens, and the shapes vanish into the green. The archaeologist's task becomes one of translation, turning ghostly patterns in satellite data into the human stories that made them. Somewhere in that translation lies the key to understanding what kind of civilization could leave such marks, only to let them disappear. Walk far enough through the Amazon, and you will notice that the ground changes beneath your feet. In some places, the earth rises gently into mounds, then dips again into shallow trenches, before flattening into broad open spaces. To the casual eye, these are just quirks of the land, minor variations caused by tree roots, floods, or erosion. But to archaeologists, they begin to look like something far more deliberate. The outlines of plazas, causeways, and platforms. Unlike the monumental stone cities of the Maya or the temples of Angkor, the Amazon's ancient urban centres were made primarily from earth. This was a choice born not out of a lack of skill, but of adaptation to the rainforest's resources. Stone is rare in much of the basin. Clay, however, is everywhere, and when shaped, compacted, and reinforced, it can last for centuries, especially when the structures are maintained by the people who built them. In parts of the Upper Xingu region, researchers have found evidence of settlements arranged around large open plazas, each connected by straight raised roads. These were not tiny hamlets. They were carefully planned urban centres with defensive ditches, water management systems, and residential zones radiating outward. The sheer amount of earth moved to create them is staggering. Estimates suggest that thousands of tons of soil were excavated and reshaped for each site. Historians are still debating whether this work was done continuously over centuries or in concentrated bursts of communal labour. A detail that often surprises people is the scale. Some plazas measure over 150 metres across, big enough to host hundreds of people at once. Imagine a place where trade, rituals and celebrations might have taken place under the open sky, surrounded by the green curtain of the forest. From the plazas, wide causeways stretch out like spokes from a wheel, leading to other settlements. Along these routes, smaller mounds and platforms appear, perhaps outposts, storage areas, or ceremonial stops. An odd, almost tangential fact: modern ant colonies in the Amazon have been found to create subterranean cities of their own, with chambers connected by long tunnels, carefully ventilated to control heat and humidity. While not the same in purpose, the similarity in network design is striking. Both humans and ants, it seems, understand the value of organized infrastructure. In some locations, these Earth cities were ringed by multiple layers of ditches. The ditches were not shallow. Some reached 5 meters deep and several meters wide, with the excavated soil piled into embankments. Defensive works? Perhaps. Or perhaps they served as water channels, doubling as barriers during the rainy season. The design suggests versatility, a clever merging of military and environmental needs. Curiously, pottery shards are often found embedded in the soil of these structures. Some are simple utilitarian vessels, others decorated with intricate geometric patterns. These fragments serve as cultural fingerprints, showing stylistic similarities across sites hundreds of kilometers apart. This has fueled the hypothesis that many of these cities were part of a shared cultural sphere, distinct in local practices but united in certain traditions. Skeptics, of course, point out that without monumental architecture, it's difficult to prove these were cities in the traditional sense. There are no stone temples, no towering pyramids to rival those of other ancient civilizations, but perhaps that's the wrong comparison. The absence of stone doesn't mean the absence of complexity. It means we need to redefine what urbanism looks like in a tropical forest. In this environment, permanence doesn't come from the materials you use, it comes from the systems you maintain. One of the more intriguing discoveries is that these earthen cities often appear in clusters. In the Upper Singu, for example, a dozen or more sites are located within a relatively small radius, connected by straight roads and surrounded by fertile terra preta fields. Each site seems to have had its own core plaza and infrastructure, but all were linked in a network, almost like neighborhoods within a larger urban region. This kind of pattern challenges the idea that rainforest societies were necessarily small and isolated. Historians are still debating whether these networks represent a centralized political structure, like a kingdom, or a looser confederation of allied communities. The evidence could support either case. But what's clear is that the people here were not struggling in isolation. They were thriving in a connected, organized world. And yet these places are invisible until you strip the forest away. Stand in one of these plazas today, and you might not even realize where you are. Trees as tall as 10-story buildings rise where crowds once gathered. The mounds are so gentle underfoot that you could walk over them without noticing. The roadbeds are swallowed by undergrowth, the ditches softened by centuries of rain. Without LiDAR, they might never have been seen again. The fact that so much of this has survived at all is remarkable. In a landscape where wooden structures vanish within decades, the earth remembers longer. These shapes in the soil are like faint scars, a memory of human hands shaping the land, persisting long after the people themselves have gone. One can imagine the builders standing on these same raised roads centuries ago, looking out over fields and gardens, the air filled with the smell of cooking, fires and the sound of voices. The forest was always there, just beyond the boundary, but here, in the heart of the city, there was space, open, deliberate, human space. It's a reminder that civilization doesn't always announce itself with stone monuments. Sometimes it speaks softly, in the language of clay and soil, in the geometry you can only see from above, in the patient work of generations who understood that permanence is not always about materials. It's about the memory you leave behind in the earth. By the time Columbus's ships appeared on the eastern horizon of the Americas, the great civilizations of the Andes and Mesoamerica, like the Inca and the Aztec, were at their height. In contrast, the Amazon, at least in the European imagination, was seen as a mysterious fringe, a vast, untamed wilderness dotted with small, scattered communities. That perception has lingered for centuries, shaping not only how outsiders see the rainforest but also how its past has been studied, or ignored. Yet when we start piecing together the archaeological evidence, a very different picture emerges, one in which the Amazon was not a remote frontier, but a place of dense, organized societies that flourished long before Europeans arrived. Dating techniques, from radiocarbon analysis of charcoal in terra preta soils to stratigraphy in excavated sites, point to human occupation here stretching back thousands of years. Some of the most striking evidence comes from settlements that appear to have been thriving between 800 and 1500 CE, centuries before Columbus set sail. The plazas, roads, and earthworks in regions like Acre and the Upper Singu were not the hurried constructions of desperate survivors. they were the cumulative product of generations of planning. Historians are still debating whether these cultures rose independently or were influenced by trade and contact with distant civilizations. This timeline is significant because it disrupts the comfortable narrative that large-scale, complex societies in the Americas were confined to highlands and coasts. Instead, it suggests that during the same centuries when medieval Europe was building cathedrals and sprawling market towns, the Amazon may have had its own thriving urban landscapes, constructed of earth and vegetation rather than stone, but no less sophisticated. One of the challenges in studying these societies is that their material culture differs from the stone and metal artifacts archaeologists often rely upon. In the rainforest, perishable materials like wood, fibre, and even textiles can vanish within decades. What survives are pottery fragments, charred seeds, soil modifications, and the stubborn geometry of the land itself. These traces require a different kind of reading, less like flipping through a history book and more like reconstructing a story from a handful of scattered half-erased sentences. Oddly enough, some of the most compelling connections between these pre-Columbian Amazonian societies and their counterparts elsewhere come from trade goods. Archaeologists have found marine shells deep in the rainforest, hundreds of miles from the nearest coast, as well as stone tools made from materials sourced far outside the basin. These finds imply long-distance exchange networks, either through direct expeditions or through intermediary trade. They also suggest that the Amazon was not isolated, but part of a continental web of commerce and cultural contact. In the upper Madeira River region, for instance, ceremonial mounds and causeways appear to date from the same period as complex polities in the Andes. Some researchers have proposed that these societies may have exchanged crops, technologies, and even symbolic practices across ecological zones. Others argue for a more independent trajectory, with the Amazonian centers developing along their own lines, while selectively adopting outside ideas. The truth may lie somewhere in between, as is often the case in history. A hypothesis worth noting is that the Amazon civilizations were masters of adapting to microenvironments. While the Inca terraced mountainsides and the Maya built reservoirs in limestone plains, the peoples of the Amazon created raised fields in floodplains, dug canals to control seasonal waters, and cultivated orchards that blended seamlessly with the surrounding forest. This strategy not only supported large populations, but may have been more sustainable than slash-and-burn agriculture. And yet, when European explorers like Francisco de Orellana journeyed through in the 1540s, they encountered what seemed to be thriving riverfront communities. Orellana described towns so near together that they seemed like a single city, with markets, cultivated fields, and political organization. These accounts were dismissed for centuries as exaggeration, but when we place them alongside the archaeological evidence, they begin to seem more plausible. Historians are still debating whether Orellana saw these societies at their peak or whether they were already in decline. The decline, if it came quickly, might not have been the result of conquest in the traditional sense. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, could have spread ahead of colonizers, carried by traders, captives, or simply by contact between inland groups and coastal peoples who had already encountered Europeans. In a region where communities were connected by waterways, a contagion could move with frightening speed. One chilling comparison comes from the Mississippi River Valley, where the great mound city of Cahokia had already declined by the time Europeans arrived in North America, likely due to a mix of environmental stress and disease. In the Amazon, such a collapse could have been even more rapid and complete, given the forest's ability to reclaim cleared land in a matter of decades. Within a single human lifetime, plazas could be overgrown, roads buried in, leaf litter, and entire cities rendered invisible. An odd fact to hold on to here: in the humid tropics, certain tree species will preferentially sprout in abandoned clearings where soil has been enriched by human activity. This means that even without ruins, the forest itself can act as a living map of past settlement, if you know which patterns to look for. Botanists studying forest islands in the Amazon have found that some clusters of useful trees, like Brazil nuts, palms, and cacao, are the legacy of ancient cultivation, persisting long after their planters vanished. The implications of this timeline are profound. It suggests that when Europeans first arrived in South America, they may have been seeing not the untouched wilderness of romantic imagination, but the aftermath of a massive demographic collapse. The forest that seemed eternal and unbroken was in some sense a regrowth, a green shroud over a once densely inhabited landscape. This view is still controversial. For some scholars, it threatens to romanticize the past or overstate the scale of Amazonian urbanism. For others, it offers a long overdue correction to the assumption that the rainforest was always empty of complexity. The truth will depend on more evidence, more LiDAR scans, more excavations, more interdisciplinary work combining archaeology, ecology, and oral history. But even now, enough has been uncovered to imagine a time when the rivers were crowded highways, when the plazas echoed with trade and ceremony, and when the forest itself was as much a human creation as a natural one. In that light, the idea of untouched wilderness begins to feel like one of the most persistent myths of all. If the great plazas, mounds, and causeways of the Amazon are the bones of its ancient cities, then Terra Preta is the lifeblood that made them possible. This black earth is unlike anything else in the rainforest. Rich, dark, and crumbly, it stands out against the natural soils of the region, which are notoriously poor in nutrients. In much of the Amazon, the topsoil is thin, and rain leaches minerals away quickly, making large-scale agriculture nearly impossible without constant clearing and moving. And yet, here and there across the basin, archaeologists and farmers alike have stumbled upon patches of earth so fertile that they continue to produce abundant crops centuries after they were first made. The term terra preta comes from Portuguese, meaning black earth, and its very existence is a quiet challenge to the long-held assumption that the Amazon could never support dense populations. This soil is not a geological accident. It is man-made. Layer by layer, it was built through the deliberate addition of charcoal, broken pottery, food scraps, fish bones, and other organic material. Over generations, these layers transformed otherwise poor soil into a nutrient-rich foundation that could support maize, beans, squash, cassava, and a staggering variety of other crops. Historians are still debating whether the creation of Terra Preta was an intentional agricultural strategy or a fortunate byproduct of ancient living patterns. The scale of its distribution, however, suggests deliberate planning. Some patches stretch for several hectares, and when mapped, they appear near ancient settlement sites, along roads, and in proximity to earthworks. In many cases, the patches are interconnected, forming what might once have been a continuous zone of farmland surrounding urban centres. Oddly enough, modern farmers in the Amazon still prize Terra Preta for its productivity. In places where the ancient soil has been discovered, crops grow with little or no artificial fertilizer. Scientists have found that the charcoal in Terra Preta resists decomposition, helping the soil retain nutrients and moisture for centuries. The exact techniques used to create it remain a matter of study. Some researchers have tried to replicate the process, producing what they call biochar as a modern equivalent, but the ancient formula, whether in the proportions, the microbial communities, or the exact preparation, remains elusive. A curious off-topic fact: similar dark earths have been found in parts of Africa, particularly in Liberia and Ghana, where they are also linked to long-term human habitation. This raises the tantalizing question of whether such soil-making practices arose independently in different parts of the world, or whether knowledge of them travelled along ancient trade routes. The implications of Terra Preta for understanding Amazonian civilization are enormous. Large populations require stable, reliable food sources. Without fertile soil, sustaining even a moderately sized community in the rainforest would be a constant struggle. Terra Preta, however, turns that equation on its head. It allows for permanent agriculture, freeing communities from the need to move constantly in search of new land. It also supports the growth of orchards and managed forests, which could provide food, medicine, and materials year-round. Some archaeologists believe that Terra Preta was part of a broader system of landscape engineering. In this view, the forest itself was, in many places, an anthropogenic creation, a mosaic of cultivated plots, fruit tree groves, and managed woodlands designed to mimic natural ecosystems while providing a steady stream of resources. Botanists studying the distribution of useful tree species in the Amazon have found that certain areas have far higher concentrations of edible and medicinal plants than would occur naturally. These forest gardens might have been planted and maintained by human hands over centuries, blending so seamlessly with the surrounding wild that even modern scientists mistook them for untouched jungle. Critics caution that not all fertile patches in the Amazon are ancient or human-made, and that natural processes can sometimes mimic the appearance of Terra Preta. However, the combination of archaeological artifacts such as pottery shards and the sheer age of the soil in confirmed sites makes a strong case for widespread, deliberate soil creation. Radiocarbon dating has shown some terra preta to be more than 2,000 years old, still fertile today. The role of terra preta also complicates the idea of the Amazon as a fragile ecosystem incapable of sustaining intensive agriculture. Modern large-scale farming in the rainforest often leads to rapid soil depletion and ecological damage, but the ancient systems appear to have been sustainable over the long term. If these practices were revived or adapted today, they might offer lessons for agriculture in tropical environments worldwide. Imagine, for a moment, walking through an Amazonian city 1,000 years ago. Around you, the streets open onto fields of maize and cassava, the soil black and rich beneath the plants. Beyond the fields, groves of fruit trees, peach palm, Brazil nut, guava, form a living boundary between the cultivated land and the deeper forest. Farmers tend the crops while others collect medicinal herbs, fish from managed ponds, or work in shaded communal areas shaping pottery and weaving baskets. It is a scene of abundance, supported not by endless expansion into new territory, but by the careful cultivation of land designed to last for generations. An especially intriguing aspect of terra preta is its microbial composition. Modern studies have shown that these soils host unique communities of bacteria and fungi that contribute to their fertility. This biological complexity may be part of why attempts to recreate terra preta in modern labs have not fully succeeded. The ancient Amazonian farmers may not have known the microbial science, but they understood the results, passing down the knowledge in practice, if not in theory. In this way, terra preta is more than just soil. It is a record of knowledge. Every handful is a mixture of the physical remains of daily life: charred wood from cooking fires, discarded bones from meals, broken pots from feasts, plant matter from harvests. It is, quite literally, the city's history underfoot. When archaeologists sift through it, they find not just evidence of agriculture, but also a glimpse into the culture, what people ate, what they made, and how they lived together. This ancient soil invites a hypothesis as bold as any in Amazonian archaeology, that the rainforest we know today is, in significant part, a legacy of human cultivation. If that is true, then the green expanse often described as primeval is actually, at least in part, the overgrown remains of an ancient garden, one so vast and well tended that, even centuries after its caretakers were gone, it could sustain itself. And as you stand in a patch of terra preta today, you might not see the city it once fed. The forest has reclaimed the plazas and the causeways, the voices are gone, but the earth still remembers, holding its richness like a secret, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to notice. Step away from the river, away from the fertile black earth and the plazas, and you will eventually find something unexpected. Lines in the forest that seem to ignore the chaos of the jungle. They run straight, stubbornly straight, over ridges and through valleys, sometimes for kilometers without a single bend. In a place where modern footpaths twist around obstacles and animal trails meander with the terrain, these roads are striking. They are the work of people who decided the land would follow their plan, not the other way around. The most famous examples come from the Upper Xingu region, where networks of raised causeways link ancient settlements. These causeways were not narrow tracks, but broad, levelled pathways, some up to 50 metres wide, with embankments on either side. In the rainy season, when the forest floor turns to mud and rivers flood their banks, these raised roads would have remained passable, keeping communities connected year-round. Historians are still debating whether these causeways were primarily for practical transport, for ceremonial processions, or for both. The sheer width of some suggests they were more than just footpaths. They may have been designed for moving goods in bulk, perhaps using sledges or carrying frames, or for accommodating large groups during communal events. A curious off-topic fact: certain leafcutter ants in the Amazon maintain their own highways, clear paths through the undergrowth leading to their nests, sometimes stretching hundreds of meters. These ant roads, while tiny in scale, are kept remarkably clean and direct. It's a strange echo of the human impulse to impose order on the forest. LiDAR surveys have shown that these causeways often radiate from central plazas like spokes from a wheel, connecting to smaller settlements, agricultural fields, and even remote ceremonial sites. Some run in parallel for great distances, hinting at planned grids or boundary lines. others linked to ancient bridges or fording points, suggesting a sophisticated knowledge of local hydrology. One hypothesis is that these road networks functioned like the arteries of a political or economic system, moving goods, ideas, and people between allied communities. If you imagine the Amazonian basin as a tapestry, these roads were the threads that held it together. Archaeologists have noted that certain pottery styles and tool types are found across wide areas linked by causeways, supporting the idea of sustained contact and shared culture. It's also possible that the roads had symbolic importance. In some parts of the world, processional roads lead to sacred spaces, serving as both physical and spiritual connectors. The straightness of many Amazonian causeways might reflect not just practicality, but an alignment with cosmological beliefs, paths that mirrored celestial order or traced ancestral journeys. Historians are still debating whether the alignments seen in LiDAR maps were intentional astronomical references or simply the most efficient routes across the terrain. The construction of these causeways was no small task. Without metal tools or draft animals, builders would have relied on wooden implements, fire, and sheer human labour to clear, level, and raise the paths. Maintaining them would have been an ongoing communal responsibility, especially in a climate where vegetation grows back quickly and rains can wash away soil in a single season. The fact that these roads endured long enough to leave visible traces today suggests they were valued for centuries. One of the more fascinating aspects of these networks is their redundancy. In many areas, multiple causeways link the same two settlements, creating alternative routes. This could indicate traffic management, seasonal changes in passability, or the need for ceremonial and practical paths to remain separate. It might also have been a political strategy, ensuring that if one path was blocked, another could be used, maintaining connection even in times of conflict. In the modern Amazon, some of these ancient routes have been repurposed as contemporary paths or logging roads, though often without the people using them realizing their true age. In satellite imagery, you can sometimes see a modern track following the ghost of a pre-Columbian causeway, like a palimpsest of human movement layered over centuries. The existence of these roads challenges the enduring myth of isolation in the Amazon. Far from being a wilderness of scattered self-sufficient villages, this was a connected landscape. The roads tell us that people were moving, regularly, deliberately, and in large enough numbers to make the building and upkeep of these causeways worthwhile. Archaeologists studying the Upper Xingu have described the layout of some regions as garden cities, where urban hubs were surrounded by managed forest and farmland, all linked by these straight raised roads. This image stands in stark contrast to the idea of Amazonian people as wandering foragers. Instead, it paints a picture of a settled, organised world with a strong sense of spatial planning. Oddly enough, the scale of these causeways means that in some places they can be seen even without LiDAR, if you know where to look. A subtle rise under the forest floor, a line of slightly different vegetation, or an inexplicable straight clearing might be all that remains. To walk one is to follow in the footsteps of countless others, moving along the same path centuries apart, perhaps for entirely different reasons. And as with so much in the Amazon, the question lingers: why did these roads fall into disuse? If disease or societal collapse swept through, the communal effort needed to maintain the causeways would have evaporated. Within a generation, vegetation would begin to reclaim them, and within a few more, they would be all but invisible. Today, the roads are no longer filled with processions or trade caravans. They are silent, overgrown, their embankments softened by centuries of rain. But in their stubborn straightness they still speak, of connection, of ambition, and of a time when the forest was threaded with human intention. When you look at the Amazon today, it's easy to see it as the very definition of nature untouched. A vast, wild sprawl of trees and vines, where human presence is just a thin film along the rivers. But step back, take a longer view, and you start to notice something peculiar. Certain groves are dominated by edible species, Brazil nut trees clustered together in tight groups, peach palms standing in neat rows, cacao appearing in unusually dense patches far from any modern farm. In other places, the forest seems to be arranged in layers, tall canopy trees sheltering mid-level fruit bearers, with medicinal plants thriving in the filtered light below. It begins to look less like randomness and more like design. Botanists and ecologists studying the Amazon over the last few decades have increasingly come to a radical conclusion. Much of the forest, perhaps even the parts we think of as wild, may actually be the legacy of ancient cultivation. The theory is known as the domesticated forest hypothesis. It proposes that the pre-Columbian inhabitants of the basin deliberately shaped the composition of the forest over centuries, selecting and planting species that were most useful for food, medicine, and construction. These cultivated zones blended into the surrounding wilderness so well that even modern scientists mistook them for untouched ecosystems. Historians are still debating how extensive this practice was. Some argue that it might have been concentrated around settlements and along waterways. Others suggest it could have reached deep into the interior, creating a patchwork of managed landscapes that collectively covered millions of hectares. What's not in doubt is that many tree species in the Amazon are disproportionately clustered near archaeological sites, suggesting a link between human presence and botanical abundance. A curious off-topic fact: in Borneo, certain species of fig trees appear in unnaturally dense stands because they were planted by ancient communities that considered them sacred. Even after those communities vanished, the fig groves persisted for centuries, continuing to feed wildlife and subtly alter the local ecosystem. The Amazon's Brazil nut groves may be a similar case, trees planted long ago, now providing a bounty to animals and humans alike. The most striking evidence for ancient botanical engineering comes from forest islands in the Amazonian savannas, small patches of elevated ground surrounded by grasslands. These islands often contain a higher proportion of edible plants than the surrounding forest, and many sit atop archaeological deposits of pottery, charcoal, and food remains. It appears that ancient people raised these islands artificially, planting them with useful species and using them as permanent resource hubs in otherwise inhospitable environments. If the forest was indeed shaped in this way, then the people who lived here weren't merely surviving, they were creating an enormous living archive. Every planted grove, every orchard, was a record of accumulated knowledge about which plants thrived together, which ones resisted pests, which could be harvested year-round. Unlike a stone monument, this record grows, reproduces and adapts, surviving in the DNA of the trees themselves. This raises a profound question. Was the Amazon, at its height, not just a home but a single continent-sized garden? If so, it challenges one of the deepest assumptions about civilization, that it is always marked by monumental architecture and cleared landscapes. Here, the markers of civilization would have been subtle, the scent of flowers that bloom at staggered intervals to provide continuous food for pollinators, the rustle of palm fronds above paths kept open for seasonal harvests, the hum of life in carefully balanced ecosystems. Historians are still debating whether such management was coordinated on a regional scale or the result of countless local decisions that, over centuries, produced a large-scale pattern. Either way, the outcome is the same: a forest that carries the fingerprints of its past caretakers in its species composition. The idea of the domesticated forest also reframes the collapse of these societies. If disease and depopulation swept through the basin after European contact, the cultivated groves would have kept growing for centuries, outlasting the communities that planted them. Over time, the neat boundaries between managed and wild would blur. What was once a tended orchard would become, to later eyes, just another piece of virgin rainforest. In this way, the forest itself became the tomb and the monument of the people who shaped it. An odd but telling detail: modern genetic studies have found that some varieties of crops in the Amazon, such as certain types of cassava, have more genetic diversity in the wild than in cultivated plots. This suggests that ancient farmers may have deliberately encouraged their crops to grow in semi-wild conditions, mixing domesticated and wild strains to maintain resilience. It's a farming strategy that blurs the line between agriculture and ecology, between city and wilderness. The implications of this are immense, not only for understanding the Amazon's past but for its future. If much of the forest is already anthropogenic, then its preservation is not about freezing it in a natural state, but about continuing a relationship that humans have had with it for millennia. Conservation, in this light, would mean restoring the role of caretaker, not excluding people entirely. Picture yourself walking through one of these ancient botanical zones 1,000 years ago. You might pass under a canopy heavy with fruit, step over a carpet of medicinal herbs, and hear the crackle of fire from a nearby clearing where someone is charring wood to enrich the soil. Everything around you would seem natural, but nearly everything would also have been chosen. Even the placement of trees might have been calculated to guide animals along certain paths. ensuring that game remained plentiful near human settlements. And in that vision, you start to understand that the boundary between nature and culture is far less rigid than we often imagine. The forest is not merely a backdrop to human history, it is a character in it, shaped by human hands, and in turn shaping the lives of those who lived within it. The great secret of the Amazon may be that the wildest place on Earth is also one of the most carefully made. If the image of the Amazon's ancient past is often painted in shades of harmony, lush gardens, connected roads, and thriving communities, there are also darker strokes hidden beneath the green. In some parts of the basin, archaeologists have uncovered patterns in the earth that suggest not just cooperation, but conflict. These are the remnants of ditches, palisade lines, and fortified enclosures, earthworks that speak of defence, of boundaries, and perhaps of wars that have left no written record. In the upper Xingu and other regions, certain settlements were encircled by deep, wide ditches. Some of these ditches stretch for hundreds of metres, forming complete rings around central plazas and residential zones. The embankments piled alongside them would have made formidable barriers, especially if topped with wooden palisades. Historians are still debating whether these fortifications were primarily for military defence, protection from wildlife, or control over movement in and out of a community. The sheer labour involved suggests they were built with serious intent. Oddly enough, some of these defensive structures appear in clusters, suggesting that entire regions may have been organised into zones of fortified towns, perhaps to guard valuable farmland or strategic points along major causeways. In other places, linear ditches run for kilometres, not enclosing settlements but dividing territories, possible boundary markers between different polities or clans. A curious off-topic fact: in medieval Europe, hedgerows, rows of densely planted shrubs, were sometimes used as defensive barriers, controlling not just movement, but visibility. The Amazon had no hedgerows, but the thick vegetation, when combined with earthworks, could have made certain approaches nearly impassable. An intruder would have to cut through walls of vegetation while under watch from defenders above. The existence of fortifications challenges the lingering notion that pre-Columbian Amazonian societies were universally peaceful, living in isolation with little reason for conflict. War, after all, is not exclusive to empires, with standing armies. It can arise wherever resources, territory, or honour are at stake. The fertile patches of Terra Preta, the best fishing spots, and the most productive orchards would have been worth defending and worth taking. One hypothesis is that these fortifications may also have had ceremonial significance. In many cultures, the boundaries of a settlement are as much spiritual as they are physical. Passing through a gate or crossing a ditch could have been a symbolic act, marking entry into a sacred or communal space. Historians are still debating whether the monumental ditches in the Amazon were built primarily for defence, or whether they also served as social and ritual markers. Some evidence hints at periods of heightened conflict. Archaeologists have found burn layers in certain sites, bands of charcoal and ash within the soil, possibly the remains of buildings destroyed by fire. While lightning strikes and accidental blazes are possible explanations, the pattern in some locations suggests deliberate burning. The timing of these layers sometimes coincides with changes in settlement patterns, as if communities were abandoning old sites and consolidating into fewer, more heavily defended centres. It's worth noting that warfare in the Amazon may have looked very different from the large-scale battles familiar from European or Asian history. The rainforest is not friendly to massed ranks or cavalry charges. Instead, conflicts may have taken the form of raids, ambushes along causeways, or the capture and control of resources. In this environment, defence might mean securing key access points to water or fertile land rather than manning a long front line. Some oral histories among modern indigenous groups in the Amazon include stories of intergroup conflict, tales of villages raided, of warriors painted for battle, of strategies for defending against surprise attacks. While it is difficult to link these directly to specific archaeological sites, they add a human dimension to the ditches and embankments. They remind us that the past was lived by people with rivalries, alliances, and ambitions. An odd parallel emerges when you consider that similar defensive earthworks exist in vastly different parts of the world. From Iron Age hill forts in Britain to wooden stockades in North America. Across cultures, people have used earth and wood to shape the landscape for protection. In the Amazon, where stone was scarce and metal absent, these materials were not just the most practical, They were the only viable choice. The defensive works also suggest political complexity. Fortifications imply the existence of leaders capable of organizing labor on a large scale, of coordinating construction efforts, and of maintaining vigilance over time. They hint at alliances, communities banding together to protect shared resources, as well as divisions. If the causeways were the arteries of the Amazonian world, the fortifications were its armor. But as with so much in this story, the forest has hidden the rest. The wooden palisades have rotted away, the watch platforms have fallen, and the stories of the people who manned them have been lost to the leaves. What remains are the scars in the earth, faint but deliberate, running in circles and lines beneath the canopy. They are enough to tell us that life in ancient Amazonia was not always harmonious, that there were times when even in this green abundance, people felt the need to defend what was theirs. And perhaps that makes these societies feel more real. They were not mythical gardeners in a timeless paradise. They were human, with all the cooperation and competition that entails. They built, they planted, they traded, and when they had to, they fought. The ditches, silent now, once marked the edge between safety and danger, between us and them. If there is any place in the Amazon where the forest has been persuaded, however briefly, to part with its secrets, it is the Upper Xingu region of Brazil. For decades, archaeologists working here suspected there was more to the landscape than the scattered villages visible today. The oral traditions of the Quikero people spoke of vast ancient settlements, and a few faint mounds and ditches hinted at something larger. But it wasn't until the arrival of LiDAR that the full scale of what lay beneath the canopy came into focus. What those laser pulses revealed is nothing short of astonishing. A network of ancient urban grids stretching across tens of kilometers. These were not random clearings or haphazard clusters of huts. They were planned, structured and connected, a kind of Amazonian city planning that rivals anything seen in pre-Columbian North or South America. Historians are still debating whether these complexes were best described as cities or as dense agglomerations of towns, but either way their scale is undeniable. At the heart of each settlement lay a large central plaza, often perfectly square or circular, bounded by low earthen embankments. From these plazas, wide straight roads radiated outward in the cardinal directions, linking to smaller satellite communities. In some cases, the roads ran for several kilometers, connecting one major plaza to another, like beads on a string. The effect is reminiscent of urban networks elsewhere in the world, though here the material was earth, not stone, and the architecture rose no higher than a well-built mound. Oddly enough, the layout of these urban centres suggests an underlying grid, with roads intersecting at right angles, neighbourhoods arranged in predictable patterns, and infrastructure that would have facilitated both movement and drainage. This regularity is one of the strongest arguments against the idea that Amazonian societies were purely small-scale and decentralised. It takes organisation, coordination, and a shared vision to produce cities laid out with such precision. A curious, off-topic fact: in ancient Rome, newly founded colonies were often laid out on a strict grid called a centriation, with streets and plots arranged according to surveying principles. The resemblance between these Roman patterns and the Upper Xing's layouts is purely coincidental, but it's a reminder that the impulse to impose order on space is a deeply human one, expressed across continents and centuries. Within the Upper Xing's network, archaeologists have identified residential zones, agricultural areas, and even what appear to be ceremonial spaces. Some of the causeways between settlements are flanked by ditches, perhaps serving as both drainage and symbolic boundaries. The scale of earth-moving involved, digging ditches, building roads, creating plazas, would have required hundreds of people working in coordination, probably under the direction of leaders or councils. The population estimates for these interconnected centres vary widely, from several thousand to tens of thousands. Part of the difficulty is that, unlike stone cities, there are no towering ruins to measure. The houses were built from wood and palm thatch, materials that vanish quickly in the rainforest. What remains are the spatial footprints, the plaza at the centre, the radial roads, the ring ditches marking former neighbourhoods. From these, archaeologists reconstruct not just the size of the population but also the rhythms of daily life: markets in the plaza, traffic along the roads, agricultural work in the surrounding fields. Some researchers see the Upper Xingu as a kind of garden city model, where urban life and agriculture were tightly integrated. Instead of sprawling stone metropolises, the Amazonian model was one of dispersed but connected hubs, each surrounded by fertile terra preta fields and orchards. This arrangement would have allowed for both dense population clusters and sustainable resource management, reducing the strain on any single area of forest. Historians are still debating how politically unified this network was. Was there a central authority coordinating construction and trade, or was it more like a federation of allied towns? The uniformity of design hints at shared cultural or political frameworks, but the distances involved and the diversity of the Amazon make a single centralized government less certain. Perhaps the Upper Xingu cities were bound together not by one ruler, but by a web of kinship, trade agreements, and religious traditions. There is also evidence of social stratification. The largest plazas and most elaborate earthworks are found in certain nodes of the network, suggesting that these may have been the seats of powerful leaders or religious specialists. Smaller satellite communities may have paid tribute or participated in regional gatherings at these major centres. If so, the roads would have carried not just goods and workers, but also ideas, stories, and news. What makes the Upper Xingu especially fascinating is how it has persisted, albeit transformed, into the present. The modern Kwikoro villages still maintain central plazas as the heart of community life, and some of their ceremonial traditions may echo those practiced in the ancient cities. In this way, the ghost cities are not entirely gone. They live on in cultural memory and practice. An odd and humbling detail. Even with modern technology, archaeologists have only mapped a fraction of the Upper Xing's potential sites. For every plaza revealed by LiDAR, there may be several more still hidden under the canopy, their roads choked with vines, their boundaries softened by centuries of leaf fall. The forest, patient as ever, waits for the next pulse of light to peel it back. In these ghost cities, we see the clearest refutation yet of the myth of an untouched Amazon. Here were planned urban landscapes, connected across miles, sustained by engineered soils and managed forests, defended by ditches, and animated by the movement of people and goods. And then, in what seems like an instant on the scale of history, they were gone. Standing in a plaza today, surrounded by trees, it's hard to imagine the space filled with the noise of daily life, the laughter of children, the sound of tools on wood, the voices calling from one end to the other. But the shape of the land remembers. The geometry is still there, even if the people are not. And in that geometry lies the quiet truth. The Amazon has always been more than it appears. The forest may forget the sound of a city, but people carry memories in other ways. In the Amazon, where the earth reclaims wood and clay with merciless speed, the past is often preserved not in stone walls or inscriptions, but in stories, myths, songs, and oral histories passed down through generations. These tales, told by firelight or whispered on long canoe journeys, are not always straightforward records. They are layered with symbolism, transformed by retelling, and woven into the fabric of daily life. And yet, within them, there are fragments that seem to echo the archaeological record. Among some indigenous groups in the basin, there are stories of vast villages connected by wide roads, of plazas where great gatherings were held, and of feasts so large that the smoke from the cooking fires darkened the sky. Other tales speak of journeys that took days along a single straight path, lined with fruiting trees and marked by the houses of distant relatives. Historians are still debating whether these stories are literal memories passed down from the builders of the earthworks, or whether they are cultural motifs that happen to align with archaeological findings. The coincidence, however, is striking. In the oral traditions of the Kwikoro people of the Upper Xingu, the world is organized around the village plaza, with cardinal roads leading outward, a pattern that matches the layouts revealed by LiDAR. Elders describe how these roads once connected many settlements, some so far apart that a traveller might spend weeks visiting kin before returning home. While these accounts are part of a living cultural identity, they also serve as a reminder that memory can outlast material remains. A curious off-topic fact: in Norse sagas, passed orally for centuries before being written down, there are references to lands across the sea, Vinland, that were long dismissed as fantasy. Only in the 20th century did archaeologists confirm a Norse site in Newfoundland. It's a reminder that oral history, even when entangled with myth, can carry kernels of truth waiting to be verified. Some Amazonian stories speak not only of abundance but of loss. There are tales of great sickness that came from far away, of entire villages falling silent, and of survivors retreating deeper into the forest. Others describe conflicts that ended with the burning of settlements and the scattering of people. These narratives resonate with archaeological evidence of sudden abandonment and layers of ash found in certain sites. Historians are still debating whether these were localized events or part of a larger regional collapse. In some traditions, the origins of certain useful plants are tied to ancestral journeys. A mythical figure might plant a grove of Brazil nuts along a road, ensuring that travelers would always have food. Over centuries, such groves could become self-sustaining, and their presence along ancient causeways would reinforce the story. Archaeologists studying the distribution of useful tree species have found patterns that seem to follow old settlement networks, suggesting that these myths may encode practical knowledge about landscape management. There is also a category of stories that seem purely fantastical: cities of gold hidden in the forest, rivers that run with milk, giants who carved the land with their footsteps. While these cannot be taken literally, they may represent a kind of narrative camouflage. In regions where knowledge was power, sacred or practical information could be concealed within metaphor, shared only with those who knew how to interpret it. A tale of a golden city might, for example, be a poetic reference to a fertile, well-managed region, golden not in metal, but in value. An odd but telling detail is that some of these oral traditions have survived even in communities that no longer inhabit the same landscapes their ancestors did. Forced relocations, epidemics, and cultural suppression have scattered many indigenous peoples, yet certain narrative motifs persist. This resilience suggests that the memory of large, organized settlements was deeply rooted in identity, not merely in geography. For archaeologists, oral histories can serve as guides, not to exact locations, but to patterns worth investigating. If multiple groups in different areas speak of long, straight roads, plazas, or fortified villages, it adds weight to the search for similar features in those regions. Conversely, oral traditions can also caution against overreach, reminding researchers that human memory is malleable, shaped by centuries of retelling and reinterpretation. Historians are still debating how much of the Amazon's pre-Columbian story can be recovered through oral traditions alone. Some argue that without written records, we will never fully understand the scale or complexity of these societies. Others counter that dismissing oral history simply because it is not written reflects a bias rooted in literate cultures. After all, the people who built the earthworks and planted the orchards clearly had the organizational skills to create complex societies, even without writing. Listening to these stories in the places they were meant to be told, in the shade of the plaza, in a canoe on a quiet riverbend, can shift one's perception of the forest. Suddenly, the undergrowth seems less like wilderness and more like a palimpsest, each vine and tree part of a living text written in a language we're only beginning to learn. And perhaps that is the lesson the oral traditions offer, that history in the Amazon is not just buried in the soil or hidden beneath the canopy. It is also carried in the mind, passed from one storyteller to another, surviving long after the roads and plazas have faded. The forest may grow over cities, but it cannot so easily overgrow the human need to remember. When Europeans first began navigating the Amazon's colossal waterways in the 16th and 17th centuries, they encountered a world that challenged their expectations. Explorers like Francisco de Orellana, Gaspar de Carvajal and others described in vivid detail riverbanks lined with settlements, bustling markets, elaborate gardens, and communities large enough to rival towns in Europe. Carvajal's 1542 account even speaks of villages so close together that they seemed as one continuous city. Yet, within a few generations, these descriptions would be recast as exaggerations, fantasies, or outright fabrications. The dismissal wasn't entirely without reason. By the time later European expeditions retraced Orellana's route, many of the settlements he described were gone. Where there had been villages and farmland, they found stretches of unbroken forest. To those who came later, the earlier accounts seemed impossible. They assumed Orellana had been deceived by mirages of smoke, or that his starving, feverish men had imagined the scale of what they saw. Historians are still debating whether this rapid vanishing act was the result of direct European violence or something far more insidious: disease. The first waves of European contact, even indirect, may have introduced smallpox, measles, influenza, and other pathogens into the basin. These could have swept ahead of explorers, carried along trade networks and between communities, long before significant numbers of Europeans entered the region. A civilization linked by roads and rivers, its great strength, could also be devastatingly vulnerable to contagion. An odd off-topic fact: in 1347, the Black Death swept across Europe so quickly that some towns were infected before the first reports even reached them. The same phenomenon could have played out in the Amazon, but without chroniclers or city records, the devastation would have left almost no historical trace except absence. By the 18th century, the prevailing European view of the Amazon was of a green desert, a land teeming with plants and animals but too poor in soil and resources to sustain large human populations. This idea fit neatly into the Enlightenment's tidy categories, in which great civilizations required fertile plains, stone monuments, and intensive agriculture. The lush but nutrient-poor rainforest in their minds could only support small, scattered bands of subsistence farmers and foragers. This European blind spot shaped centuries of scholarship. Early ethnographers, seeing no monumental ruins like those of the Maya or Inca, concluded that complex societies had never existed here. They ignored the possibility that civilizations could rise and thrive without leaving behind towering stone structures. Historians are still debating how much of this oversight was due to genuine misunderstanding and how much was shaped by colonial attitudes that underestimated indigenous ingenuity. The irony is that, in their own way, the early chroniclers like Orellana were closer to the truth than the scholars who dismissed them. His descriptions of densely settled riverbanks align remarkably well with modern archaeological evidence, terra preta soils, earthworks and road networks, found along those same stretches of river. What he saw may indeed have been the last flourishing generation of a society on the brink of collapse, its decline accelerated by diseases it had no defense against. One hypothesis gaining traction is that the European misreading of the Amazon's history was partly a matter of cultural bias. In Europe, grandeur was equated with stone, masonry, and permanence. In the Amazon, grandeur was measured in living systems: fertile black earth that could feed thousands, orchards that fruited year-round, roads raised above floodwaters. These were not the kinds of monuments that impressed stone-obsessed visitors, especially when the jungle could erase them in a matter of decades. Oddly enough, even when Europeans encountered obvious signs of past engineering, straight ditches, geometric earthworks, they often explained them away as natural formations. Some 19th century explorers noted the strange shapes, but concluded they must be the remnants of ancient river channels, or the work of unusually orderly termite colonies. It was easier to believe in nature's accidental geometry than in the possibility of a vanished civilization. The result was a narrative vacuum. For centuries, the history of the Amazon before European contact was told as a kind of blank page filled with romanticized images of untouched wilderness. Only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with the help of satellite imagery, LiDAR, and interdisciplinary fieldwork, has that page begun to fill again, with stories of cities, gardens, roads, and societies that rivaled the great centers of the Americas. This blind spot is a cautionary tale for modern archaeology. It shows how absence of evidence can be mistaken for evidence of absence, especially when filtered through cultural assumptions. If the forest can hide a network of cities for centuries, what else might it be hiding? And how many other parts of the world have been misread because they do not fit the templates inherited from the ruins of Greece, Rome, or Egypt? Today, the Amazon is beginning to be reimagined, not as a place that civilization barely touched, but as a place that civilization shaped in ways we're only starting to understand. The forest may never yield up all its secrets, but each discovery makes the old dismissals harder to defend. And the words of Orellana and Carvajal, once written off as fever dreams, now sound less like fantasy and more like prophecy. When you try to picture the collapse of an ancient society, you might imagine the clash of armies, the smoke of burning cities, the rise and fall of kings. But in the Amazon, the most devastating conqueror may have been something far less visible, something you could not fight with walls or weapons. In the decades following the first European contact, a wave of sickness is thought to have moved through the basin, sweeping from village to village along the waterways and footpaths that once united this green world. Smallpox, measles, influenza. These diseases, common in Europe and Asia, were entirely new here. The immune systems of Amazonian peoples had no experience with them, no inherited defences. mortality rates could have reached 50, 70, even 90% in some communities. Historians are still debating the exact scale and speed of the epidemic, but its effects would have been catastrophic. Imagine a thriving network of settlements, roads connecting plazas, orchards heavy with fruit, fields of cassava and maize. Then, almost overnight, the workforce that maintained the fields and roads is gone. The few survivors scatter, some seeking refuge deep in the forest, others joining neighbouring communities carrying the disease with them. Within a single growing season, the fields lie untended. Within a few years, the forest begins to reclaim the roads. In a decade, the visible signs of human order have faded under vines and leaf litter. Oddly enough, a similar story played out in another part of the Americas. In the Mississippi River Valley, the city of Cahokia, home to tens of thousands, was in decline by the time Europeans arrived, possibly due to environmental pressures. But in other regions, like coastal New England, epidemics brought by early contact decimated indigenous populations, even before large numbers of settlers arrived. There too, the absence of people allowed forests to reclaim cleared land in a matter of years. In the Amazon, the transformation may have been even faster. The rainforest is relentless in its reclamation. A wooden structure can rot away within a decade. Agricultural plots can vanish under regrowth so complete that, within a generation, even the descendants of those who planted them might find no trace. The forest doesn't just erase, it overwrites. Trees grow where plazas once stood, and roots push through the embankments of ancient roads. One hypothesis suggests that the massive die-off from disease might explain why later, European explorers found so few people in areas once described as densely populated. By the 17th century, many of the great plazas and causeways could have been overgrown, their former inhabitants dispersed or absorbed into smaller, more isolated groups. In this way, the absence of large settlements became part of the European blind spot we explored earlier. Archaeological evidence lends some weight to this theory. In certain regions, the occupation layers in the soil, bands of pottery shards, charcoal and food remains, end abruptly in the decades following first contact. Above them, the soil is free of human debris, indicating a long period without habitation. This is not the slow, gradual decline you'd expect from environmental exhaustion or resource depletion. It is a sudden silence in the archaeological record. An odd off-topic fact: in the early 20th century, an influenza epidemic in Alaska wiped out so many members of certain indigenous communities that entire villages were abandoned. When archaeologists visited decades later, they found houses still standing but slowly collapsing under snow and moss, a modern echo of how swiftly human spaces can vanish without people to tend them. In the Amazon, the epidemics likely didn't arrive all at once but in waves. A region might recover slightly from one illness, only to be struck by another. Over time, the social fabric would fray. Without enough people to maintain the networks of exchange, long-distance trade would falter. Without trade, certain tools, crops and cultural practices would disappear, and without the safety of larger communities, smaller groups would be more vulnerable to both disease and conflict. Historians are still debating the extent to which these diseases spread on their own, versus being carried intentionally or accidentally by early European expeditions. What's clear is that the interconnectedness of Amazonian societies, one of their greatest strengths, became a fatal weakness in the face of pathogens. The very roads and rivers that once carried goods and news now carried death. It is difficult to imagine the psychological impact. Oral histories speak of great sicknesses, of villages that fell silent, of survivors wandering into the forest and never returning. Some traditions frame these events as the wrath of spirits or as punishment for forgotten taboos. Others speak more plainly. The sickness came from strangers. The details vary, but the sense of rupture is constant. By the time European colonization intensified, the ancient Amazonian cities were already ghosts. Their terraces and plazas lay under the canopy, their orchards gone feral. To the colonizers, it looked like the forest had always been empty of complexity. They could not see that it was a graveyard, not of individuals, but of entire ways of life. The diseases that erased so much of Amazonia's population did not just kill people, they killed memory. Without enough survivors to carry stories forward, histories were lost. Some fragments persisted in oral traditions, but the details of daily life, the names of leaders, the precise purpose of certain earthworks, all of that was swallowed along with the voices. And so, When archaeologists walk the causeways today or sift through the black earth of Terra Preta, they are not just uncovering the remains of a civilization, they are touching the aftermath of one of the most devastating epidemics in human history. The forest's silence is not natural. It is an echo of a time when that silence was forced upon it. If you've ever left something outside in the tropics, a wooden chair, a length of rope, even a pair of shoes, you'll know how quickly the rainforest takes it back. Within weeks, the damp has softened it. Within months, mold has crept across its surface. Give it a year, and vines will have wrapped around it as though it had always been part of the forest. Now imagine this on the scale of a city. That is what happened to the Amazon's plazas, causeways and homes after their caretakers were gone. The rainforest is one of the fastest reclamation engines on Earth. Unlike a desert ruin, which might stand for millennia, structures here are in constant battle with moisture, heat, and a relentless army of fungi, insects and plants. Wood rots in a decade, thatch in a season. Earthen embankments can be worn down by rain in just a few years if left untended. Within a generation, the straight line of a causeway becomes an uneven ridge beneath the undergrowth. Within 2 or 3, even that ridge is hard to spot without training. Historians are still debating how long it would have taken for the forest to reclaim the great earthworks of the Amazon after the societal collapse brought on by disease. Some argue that traces of plazas and ditches could have remained visible for centuries, especially to those who knew what to look for. Others suggest that within 50 to 100 years, much would have been so heavily overgrown that even nearby descendants might not have recognized the scale of what once stood there. Oddly enough, there's a modern comparison: the abandoned city of Pripyat near Chernobyl. In less than 40 years, its streets have been swallowed by trees, its buildings colonized by plants and animals, and that's in a temperate climate. In the humid tropics, the process is faster, more thorough, and often more beautiful, if beauty is measured by the completeness of nature's takeover. One hypothesis about Amazonian regrowth is that certain tree species act as markers of old human activity. Researchers have found unusually high densities of fruit and nut trees in areas known to have archaeological sites beneath them. It's possible that these are the descendants of ancient orchards, thriving long after their planters were gone. In other words, the forest's very composition is a shadow of the civilization it replaced. Archaeologists walking through these landscapes today often describe the disorienting experience of knowing they are standing in the middle of a city and seeing nothing but forest. LiDAR can strip away the canopy to reveal a plaza, a grid of roads, and a ring of ditches. But on the ground, all you see is a few subtle rises in the soil, perhaps a change in the way the plants grow. It is the ultimate camouflage, time and life working together to erase the hand of the builder. The speed of this transformation also explains why later European explorers saw little to support the grand claims of early chroniclers like Orellana. By the 17th and 18th centuries, many of the once cleared agricultural fields would have been indistinguishable from wild forest. Canals might have filled with sediment, roads become overgrown. Even the Terra Preta zones, while still fertile, would have been hidden under secondary growth. Without an eye trained to read these subtle signs, the landscape would appear untouched. A curious off-topic fact: during World War II, when the Japanese army abandoned certain Pacific Island bases, the jungle swallowed the airstrip so quickly that Allied pilots flying over just months later sometimes couldn't tell they had been there. In the Amazon, this process is multiplied by the sheer density and speed of growth. There is also the matter of wildlife. When humans leave, animals return in force. Capybaras graze in old clearings, jaguars reclaim the hunting grounds, and insects move into every crevice. Over centuries, their activity accelerates the breakdown of structures. A mound that was once compacted hard by human feet becomes riddled with burrows and root systems. Historians are still debating whether the forest's reclamation of these cities should be seen as erasure or preservation. On the one hand, it has hidden the Amazon's history from the world for centuries. On the other, it has protected what remains from modern exploitation. If the plazas of the Upper Xingu had stood open and visible through the colonial era, they might have been quarried, ploughed, or built over long before archaeologists could study them. The irony is sharp. The forest destroys and preserves in the same breath. It takes away the obvious signs of civilization, but leaves behind the subtle patterns, the geometry of earthworks, the fertility of ancient soils, the ghost lines of causeways that can be uncovered with patience and the right tools. And so, the The Amazon has guarded its dead cities the way a river hides its deepest currents, not by burying them in stone, but by folding them into the fabric of life. Standing in a clearing reclaimed by the jungle, you're not looking at an empty place. You're looking at a palimpsest, a layered text in which the green ink of the present is written over the faded script of the past. The story is still there, if you know how to read between the leaves. For centuries, the Amazon's greatest defense against discovery has been its own green veil. The canopy stretches unbroken for miles, blocking the view of anything beneath. Even from a plain, all you see is an endless textured carpet of leaves, a living roof that hides everything below. Archaeologists working in this environment have always faced the same challenge. How do you find cities in a forest that will not let you see the ground? The answer, in recent years, has come from a technology originally developed for mapping terrain and guiding autonomous vehicles, LiDAR, or light detection and ranging. LiDAR works by firing pulses of laser light from an aircraft or drone toward the ground. Most of those pulses bounce off the leaves and branches, but a small percentage slip through the gaps to reach the earth. By measuring the time it takes for the light to return, LiDAR can create a detailed 3D map of the surface below the vegetation. What emerges from the data is nothing short of transformative. The canopy falls away, revealing the bones of the land, mounds, ditches, causeways, plazas, laid bare in intricate detail. In the past decade, LiDAR surveys have rewritten the archaeology of the Amazon. In Acre, Brazil, it revealed hundreds of massive geometric earthworks, circles, squares, and star shapes that had been invisible from the ground. In the Upper Xingu, it uncovered entire networks of roads and plazas, their layout as precise as any city grid in the ancient world. Even in regions thought to be too remote or inhospitable for large populations, LiDAR has found traces of organized settlement. Historians are still debating how to interpret these discoveries. Do they represent a continuous landscape of urbanization, or clusters of independent communities connected by trade and shared cultural practices? The data is rich, but it is also incomplete. LiDAR can show you the shapes, but not the people, the sounds, or the stories. An odd off-topic fact: LiDAR has also been used to uncover hidden structures in completely different environments, like the lost city of Mahendraparvata in Cambodia, buried under jungle near Angkor, or ancient roads beneath the sands of New Mexico. Whether in a rainforest or a desert, it turns out that the biggest obstacle to seeing the past is often just the surface layer. One of LiDAR's greatest strengths is its ability to detect subtle features, slight rises in the ground that might mark a buried wall, faint depressions that could be ancient canals. In the Amazon, where the forest floor is a chaos of roots and debris, these features would be almost impossible to spot by walking. With LiDAR, they appear as crisp lines in the digital landscape, like veins in a leaf. The technology has also revealed the sheer scale of ancient infrastructure. Some causeways run for kilometers, linking multiple settlements in a straight line. Large plazas appear regularly along these routes like nodes in a network, and in some places the earthworks form complex nested shapes that suggest layers of planning and redesign over centuries. Such precision challenges old ideas about Amazonian societies being loosely organized. But LiDAR is not a magic bullet. It cannot tell you what a structure was used for, how it looked when it was built, or who built it. It also requires ground truthing. Archaeologists still have to visit sites to confirm what the images suggest. In some cases, features that looked like human-made embankments turned out to be natural ridges. In others, the opposite was true. The forest can create shapes that mimic human geometry, and humans can shape the land so subtly that it mimics the forest. Still, the impact has been profound. LiDAR has turned the Amazon from an empty map into a dense web of potential archaeological sites. It has shown that the question is no longer whether large, complex societies once lived here, but how many there were, how they interacted, and why they disappeared. Historians are still debating how far this technology will go in rewriting the history of the Americas. If the patterns revealed so far are representative, then the Amazon may have supported millions more people than previously imagined. This would place it among the most densely populated regions of the pre-Columbian world, alongside Mesoamerica and the Andes, but with a form of urbanism entirely its own. The most tantalizing thing about LiDAR is that it suggests the forest is still full of surprises. For every known site, there could be dozens more hidden just a few meters below the canopy. A single scan can transform a patch of green from empty forest into a map of avenues, plazas, and ceremonial spaces, and each discovery forces us to reconsider not just the Amazon, but the very definition of civilization. In the quiet glow of a LiDAR map on a researcher's screen, the forest's secrets are revealed not with a roar but with a whisper. Straight lines appear where there should be none. Curves take shape where the land should be flat. It is a reminder that technology, when used with patience and humility, can be a kind of listening, an act of paying attention to what the land has been trying to tell us all along. If terra preta was the foundation for sustaining agriculture in the Amazon, then the raised fields, canal systems, and aquaculture ponds were the engineering marvels that turned that foundation into abundance. To live in the rainforest and feed thousands of people year-round meant solving a set of problems that would have seemed impossible to outsiders: nutrient-poor soils, flooding in the rainy season, drought in the dry season, and the sheer density of vegetation competing for space and sunlight. Yet the archaeological record suggests that ancient Amazonian societies didn't just survive these challenges, they transformed them into advantages. In the seasonally flooded plains of the Llanos de Moxos in modern-day Bolivia, LiDAR and field surveys have revealed vast networks of raised agricultural fields, rectangular platforms of earth built high above the surrounding wetlands. These fields, some stretching hundreds of meters, were often aligned in grids or parallel lines, connected by canals that not only drained excess water during floods, but also provided irrigation in the dry months. When the waters rose, fish would enter the canals. When they receded, the fish could be trapped and harvested. It was farming and fishing integrated into a single system. Historians are still debating whether these raised field systems were a response to environmental stress or part of a deliberate strategy to maximize productivity. Either way, they show an intimate understanding of the local ecosystem. The fields retained warmth during cool nights, reduced crop loss from flooding, and allowed for multiple harvests in a year. Studies of ancient pollen from these areas reveal the cultivation of maize, cassava, squash, and other crops, staples that could support large, stable populations. An odd off-topic fact: similar raised field techniques were developed independently in vastly different environments, such as the chinampas of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan in the Valley of Mexico, where artificial islands were built in shallow lake beds. The parallels suggest that wherever humans face waterlogged terrain, they often arrive at similar ingenious solutions. In other parts of the Amazon, evidence points to large-scale aquaculture systems. Artificial ponds, some lined with clay or stone, were used to raise fish and turtles. These ponds were often connected to rivers by small canals with controllable inlets, allowing the water level and the stock within to be managed. The choice of species suggests careful planning: fish that could be easily bred and harvested, turtles that could be kept alive for months as a kind of living food reserve. Historians are still debating whether aquaculture was a supplementary activity or a primary source of protein for these societies. The sheer number of ponds in some regions, numbering in the hundreds, makes it plausible that fish farming was as central to life here as livestock was in other parts of the world. In some indigenous oral traditions, certain ponds are remembered as sacred sites, their origins attributed to mythical ancestors or spirits who taught people how to shape the land for food. Equally impressive are the canal systems that extend far beyond the floodplains. In the upper Xingu and other densely settled areas, straight human-made canals connect rivers, lakes, and wetlands, creating a kind of watery highway network. These canals allowed for the movement of people, goods, and food, even during the peak of the rainy season when roads became impassable. Some of these waterways may have doubled as defensive barriers, echoing the multiple purposes of causeways and ditches in the same regions. Oddly enough, modern farmers in parts of the Amazon still practice techniques that resemble ancient methods, though often without knowing their deep history. In certain floodplain communities, small raised beds are built each year to grow vegetables above the high water line, while nearby ponds are stocked with fish. The resemblance to archaeological remains suggests a remarkable continuity of knowledge, even if the original scale and complexity have been reduced. The agricultural productivity of these systems would have been immense, especially when combined with the managed forests and terra preta zones discussed earlier. A single raised field complex could yield a variety of crops, while the surrounding canals and ponds provided fish and other aquatic resources. Add in the orchards and perennial plants, and you have a diet that was diverse, nutritious, and resilient to seasonal fluctuations. Historians are still debating how far these innovations spread across the Amazon. Were they localized to certain cultural groups, or were they shared across regions through trade and migration? The similarity of certain construction techniques, from the Llanos de Moxos to parts of the Upper Amazon, hints at either direct contact or convergent evolution of ideas. In either case, the result was a form of agriculture adapted so precisely to its environment that it could sustain large semi-urban populations in a biome often dismissed as inhospitable. Perhaps the most striking aspect of these systems is their sustainability. Modern industrial agriculture in the Amazon often leads to rapid soil depletion, deforestation, and ecological collapse. The ancient systems, by contrast, worked with the rhythms of the forest and floodplain. They enriched the soil instead of depleting it, maintained biodiversity, and left behind structures that, when rediscovered, are still fertile and functional centuries later. Imagine walking through such a landscape 1,000 years ago. The elevated green of the fields stretching toward the horizon, the canals glinting in the sunlight, the quiet ripple of fish breaking the surface of the ponds. Farmers tend their crops while children gather fruit from nearby orchards. Canoes pass along the waterways, carrying baskets of maize, bundles of firewood, and pots of freshly caught fish. The scene is one of abundance. Not the abundance of a wild forest, but of a human-designed ecosystem in harmony with the wild. And yet, like the plazas and causeways, these systems vanished beneath the forest after the collapse. The canals silted up, the raised fields softened and blurred into the natural terrain. To an untrained eye, there is no hint of the engineering that once shaped the land. Only with LiDAR, aerial photography, and the patient work of archaeologists does the design emerge again, a ghostly geometry of lines and rectangles hidden in the green. These discoveries push us to rethink not only Amazonian history, but our broader definitions of agriculture, engineering, and civilization. Here, the greatest monuments were not built of stone. They were living systems, fed by rivers and rain, and designed to last as long as people cared for them. Their disappearance was not the failure of the system, but the loss of the people who knew how to keep it alive. When people think of great ancient civilizations, they tend to imagine monuments that pierce the skyline, stone pyramids, towering temples, fortified citadels. The Amazonian world, at its height, had none of these. No granite steps climbing toward the clouds, no stone colonnades casting long shadows at sunset. Instead, its achievements were built in soil, wood, and living plants. This absence of monumental stone architecture has long been one of the main reasons outsiders doubted that large, complex societies could have existed here. But the lack of stone monuments is not proof of a lack of civilization. It's a reflection of both environment and priorities. The first and most obvious reason is geological. Much of the Amazon basin is devoid of suitable building stone. Unlike the Andes, where hard volcanic rock lies close at hand, or Mesoamerica, where limestone is abundant, the lowlands offer little beyond river cobbles and occasional outcrops of soft sandstone. The effort to quarry and transport stone over long distances, through dense forest and across floodplains, would have been immense. For a society whose wealth and survival depended on adapting to the rainforest cycles, that effort may not have been worth the cost. Instead, these societies mastered the use of materials the environment provided in abundance: earth for mounds and embankments, hardwoods for pillars and walls, palm thatch for roofs. These materials were far from primitive. They were renewable, locally sourced, and could be shaped into elegant, durable structures. In some indigenous traditions today, hardwood posts are set deep into the ground, sometimes lasting for generations before needing replacement. Large communal houses supported by massive beams could stand for decades if maintained. Historians are still debating whether the choice of perishable materials was purely pragmatic or also ideological. In many cultures, impermanence is not seen as a flaw, but as a natural part of the world. Buildings are renewed, replaced, rebuilt in cycles that mirror the life of the forest itself. A temple of stone may defy the elements, but it also stands apart from the living landscape. An earthen plaza and a wooden ceremonial hall, by contrast, return to the earth when their time is done, feeding the soil that will support the next generation. An odd off-topic fact: in ancient Japan, the Shinto shrine at Issei has been torn down and rebuilt every 20 years for over a millennium. The act of renewal is considered more important than the material permanence of the structure. While separated by vast distances and cultural differences, The Amazonian approach to building may have embraced a similar principle of cyclical renewal. This reliance on perishable materials has created both a challenge and a gift for archaeology. The challenge is obvious. Wood, fibre, and thatch decay quickly in the humid tropics, leaving little behind for excavation. What remains are the earthen foundations, the plazas, the raised roads, the defensive ditches. The gift is more subtle. Because these structures return to the forest, they did not leave the kind of scar on the land that leads to ecological collapse. In this way, the Amazonian civilizations managed to sustain their landscapes for centuries without stripping them bare. The absence of monumental stone also suggests a different vision of status and legacy. In many ancient cultures, rulers immortalized themselves through grand architecture. Pyramids, statues, and palaces meant to endure for millennia. In the Amazon, prestige may have been expressed in other ways: the size of a plaza, the fertility of surrounding fields, the abundance of food at a feast, the reach of a road network. A leader's legacy might have been measured not in stone blocks stacked high, but in the living systems they cultivated and maintained. Historians are still debating whether there were any exceptions, sites where stone was used in ceremonial or symbolic ways. A few locations in the Amazon do have stone alignments or carved rock faces, often near waterfalls or river rapids. These may have served as sacred places or boundary markers, but they are rare and localized, not the foundation of architecture across the region. This absence of stone monuments also played into the European blind spot we explored earlier. To colonizers trained to see civilization in the form of masonry and masonry alone, the Amazon seemed empty of history. They did not know how to read the subtler signs, the geometry of earthworks, the pattern of tree species, the fertility of soils. To them, a plaza without walls was just a clearing, a raised road without paving was just a ridge. The cities were invisible not because they were gone, but because the criteria for recognizing them were too narrow. An odd echo of this can be found in the grasslands of the North American Midwest, where the massive earthen mounds of the Mississippian culture went unrecognized by many settlers as anything but natural hills. Only later did archaeologists uncover the vast cities, like Cahokia, that had once stood there. The Amazon's earthworks are part of that same global story. Civilizations whose architecture was hidden in plain sight because it was made of the land itself. In rethinking what constitutes a monument, the Amazon forces us to expand our definitions of civilization. A straight causeway running for kilometers through the forest is as much a statement of power and organization as a row of stone columns. A patch of terra preta that remains fertile after 1,000 years is a technological achievement no less impressive than an aqueduct. The living forest itself, reshaped to feed and shelter thousands, might be the greatest monument of all. When you walk through the Amazon today, you will not see the skyline of a lost empire. You will feel it underfoot, in the firm, level ground of an old plaza, in the unnatural straightness of a path between trees, in the quiet presence of a grove that fruits in perfect sequence. These are the monuments that remain, not stone against the sky, but earth and life against the flow of time. When most people think of cultural heartlands in the pre-Columbian Americas, their minds go first to the high plateaus of the Andes or the grand city-states of Mesoamerica. The Amazon, with its tangled rivers and endless green canopy, is rarely included in that mental map. For centuries, it was framed as a periphery, a wilderness bordering the real centers of civilization. But the emerging archaeological record paints a more complex picture, one in which the Amazon may have been not a distant frontier, but a vibrant cultural core, exerting influence far beyond its immediate basin. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for this influence comes from trade. Artifacts in Amazonian archaeological sites show that goods moved into and out of the basin over vast distances. Marine shells from the Atlantic coast appear hundreds of kilometers inland. Stone tools crafted from materials found only in the Andes turn up deep in the rainforest. And botanical evidence suggests the spread of cultivated plants like manioc, peanuts, and certain chili peppers from Amazonian domestication centers into other parts of South America. Historians are still debating the exact routes and intermediaries involved, but the breadth of exchange implies that the Amazon was plugged into a continent-wide network. Oddly enough, the botanical story may be the most important. Genetic studies of crops reveal that the Amazon was an early and independent center of domestication for multiple plant species. Manioc, in particular, seems to have radiated outward from the basin into both the Andes and coastal lowlands, becoming a staple food far from its place of origin. The same may be true for certain varieties of beans, fruits, and medicinal plants. If agriculture is a cornerstone of civilization, then the Amazon was supplying some of that stone to other builders. The cultural links go beyond food. Decorative motifs found on Amazonian pottery, geometric patterns, stylized animal forms, and symbolic color schemes share striking similarities with ceramics from distant regions. Were these simply parallel developments, or did artisans exchange ideas along with goods? Historians are still debating whether these resemblances point to shared origins, sustained contact, or the occasional spark of inspiration carried along trade routes. In the upper Xingu and along certain tributaries, the standardization of urban layouts, central plazas, radial roads, surrounding agricultural zones, suggests a common set of planning principles that may have spread from one cultural nucleus to others. This kind of planning requires more than practical knowledge. It reflects a worldview in which space is organized according to symbolic as well as functional rules. The persistence of these layouts over centuries hints at a cultural identity strong enough to influence communities far removed from the original centers. A curious off-topic fact: in West Africa, the ancient city of If influenced the art and urbanism of neighboring states for generations, even after its political power waned. Influence does not always depend on direct rule. It can persist through shared religious practices, artistic styles, or trade conventions. The Amazon may have played a similar role in its own continental sphere. Some scholars argue that the Amazon's influence extended into the Andes, where certain agricultural techniques and crop varieties bear the mark of lowland origins. The movement of goods, people, and ideas between highland and lowland was likely facilitated by intermediary regions, where rivers and mountain passes connected the two worlds. In these zones, traders and travellers could have carried not just physical goods, but stories, rituals, and technologies. Historians are still debating the direction of influence. Did certain religious symbols or political structures originate in the highlands and diffuse into the Amazon, or was it the other way around? The truth is probably a constant exchange, with innovations moving in both directions over centuries. In this light, the Amazon is not a passive recipient of ideas from elsewhere, but an active participant shaping the cultural and technological landscape of South America. Another intriguing angle comes from linguistics. Some language families in the Amazon cover enormous areas, spanning multiple ecological zones and linking communities that are geographically distant. This suggests long-term connections, possibly tied to the same trade and migration patterns that moved goods and crops. Language, after all, is one of the most enduring markers of cultural influence. An odd but telling detail: some modern indigenous groups in the Amazon still make ceremonial ornaments, musical instruments, and textiles using techniques and patterns that closely resemble artifacts found at archaeological sites hundreds, or even thousands of years old. These continuities hint at cultural traditions resilient enough to survive both environmental change and the disruptions of colonial history. If the Amazon was indeed a cultural heartland, then the narrative of South American history needs a significant revision. Instead of being the untouched green margin to the real civilizations, it becomes one of the engines of cultural exchange, shaping diets, settlement patterns, artistic styles, and perhaps even political ideas across a vast swathe of the continent. The monumental architecture of the Andes may be more visible, but the Amazon's legacy is just as deep, embedded in the crops people eat, the stories they tell, and the ways they organize their communities. And this perhaps is the most profound shift in perspective. The forest is not just a backdrop to human history. It is a stage on which history was made, a player in its own right, and a messenger whose influence can be traced far from the rivers where it began. The Amazon was not waiting to be discovered. It was already part of a conversation that spanned continents. The Amazon has a way of forcing humility on anyone who tries to tell its story. For every earthwork revealed by LiDAR, there is another buried under centuries of leaf litter. For every patch of terra preta that points to ancient ingenuity, there are kilometers of forest floor still untested. This abundance of clues, and the stubborn gaps between them, has created one of the liveliest debates in archaeology today. Just how far should these discoveries go in rewriting the history of the Americas? On one side of the debate are the maximalists, Scholars who see the emerging evidence as proof that the Amazon was home to millions of people before European contact, living in vast networks of cities, towns, and engineered landscapes. To them, the scale of the earthworks, the fertility of the terra preta fields, and the sophistication of the road and canal systems point to a level of complexity on par with the Inca heartland or the Maya lowlands. They argue that the Amazon should be recognized as a third great center of civilization in the pre-Columbian Americas, equal in significance, if not in visibility, to its highland counterparts. On the other side are the minimalists, who caution against drawing sweeping conclusions from incomplete data. They acknowledge that large, organized societies existed in parts of the basin, but argue that these were likely regional phenomena, not a continuous civilization spanning the entire rainforest. In their view, the Amazon was a mosaic of cultures, some complex and densely populated, others small and mobile, rather than a single interconnected urban world. Historians are still debating the middle ground between these positions. Was the Amazon a patchwork quilt of polities, each adapting to local conditions but tied together by trade and shared traditions? Or was it a more unified cultural landscape bound by common planning principles, agricultural practices, and religious beliefs? The answer may depend on how we define civilization itself. An odd off-topic fact: similar debates have played out in the study of the Indus Valley civilization, where sprawling networks of cities and villages show a high degree of uniformity, but little evidence of centralized political control. Some scholars see this as proof of a shared cultural sphere without a single ruling elite, an idea that may have parallels in the Amazon. One major sticking point in the Amazon debate is preservation bias. Stone monuments, by their nature, survive the centuries. Wooden structures, earthen embankments, and botanical evidence do not. This means that when we compare the Amazon to other ancient civilizations, we're often comparing what's left rather than what actually existed. It's like judging two libraries, one of which has been preserved in a dry climate, the other in a floodplain, based only on the books that survived. There is also the question of scale. Even among maximalists, population estimates vary wildly, from 2 million people in the pre-contact basin to more than 10 million. Without written records, these numbers are inferred from settlement density, agricultural potential, and ethnographic analogies. The forest's rapid reclamation of abandoned land makes it even harder to be sure. Some critics worry that the new narrative risks becoming a mirror image of the old one. Where the past view underestimated Amazonian societies, the current enthusiasm might overestimate them. They point out that the most spectacular earthworks discovered so far are concentrated in certain regions, and that large areas of the basin remain poorly studied. Until surveys cover a broader swath of the forest, we cannot know whether the dense networks found in Acre or the Upper Singhu were typical or exceptional. Yet even the minimalists agree that the discoveries of the past few decades have permanently altered the conversation. The idea of an untouched green desert is no longer defensible. Whether we're talking about a constellation of regional powers or a sprawling interconnected civilization, the Amazon's past was far richer and more complex than the image of scattered subsistence-level villages. Historians are still debating the cultural implications as well. If the Amazon was indeed a major center of domestication for important crops, then it played a foundational role in shaping diets and agriculture far beyond its borders. If its urban networks were sustained for centuries, then it mastered a form of sustainable development that modern societies might do well to study. An intriguing hypothesis is that our very definitions of urban and civilized are biased toward the visible, the monumental, and the permanent. The Amazon's form of civilization was diffuse, integrated into the landscape, and built on renewal rather than permanence. To recognize it fully, we may need to expand our cultural vocabulary, valuing managed forests and fertile soils as much as stone temples and paved roads. The debate is far from over. Each new LiDAR survey, each excavation, adds another piece to the puzzle, and sometimes replaces pieces we thought we'd already placed. But one thing is certain: the Amazon can no longer be dismissed as a passive backdrop to the continent's history. Whether it was home to millions or hundreds of thousands, whether its political structures were centralized or decentralized, it was a place where human ingenuity thrived, adapted, and left a mark still visible if you know how to look. And in that sense, perhaps the forest has the final word in the debate. It reminds us that civilizations don't have to shout their existence in stone. Sometimes they speak in soil, in tree canopies, and in the subtle lines that only reveal themselves when you strip away the green. If you were to rise high above the Amazon now, in the slow fade of late afternoon, you'd see nothing but an endless, rippling sea of green. The light would catch on the crowns of emergent trees, their leaves trembling in the humid air, and the rivers below would wind like silver threads through the dark weave of the canopy. From that height the forest would look whole, eternal, untouched. You would never guess what lies beneath, and perhaps that is how the Amazon prefers it. The green curtain does not merely conceal, it protects. It hides the ghost geometry of plazas and roads, the faint outlines of raised fields, the ancient orchard still fruiting in the right season. It keeps safe the black earth that has outlived its makers, the canals that once carried canoes heavy with crops and fish. These are not just remnants, they are chapters of a history that has resisted erasure, even if it has embraced disguise. Historians are still debating how much of that history we will ever recover. Even with LiDAR and satellite mapping, even with patient excavation, and the stories preserved in indigenous memory, the forest guards more than it gives away. For every discovery that changes the narrative, there are 1,000 unanswered questions. How were these societies governed? How far did their influence reach? What songs were sung in the plazas? What decisions made in the shade of communal halls? An odd off-topic fact: in the 19th century, archaeologists in the Middle East thought the ancient city of Babylon was little more than a biblical legend, until they uncovered its walls beneath layers of sand. What was once dismissed as myth became tangible history. The Amazon may be undergoing its own Babylon moment, one LiDAR scan at a time. But there is a difference here. In the desert, ruins stand naked to the sun. In the rainforest, ruins are clothed in life. The same trees that hide the past are also the descendants of its design. Forest gardens planted centuries ago, now indistinguishable from the wild. In a way, the ancient Amazonian cities never truly vanished. They simply shifted form, exchanging walls for trunks, plazas for groves, and roads for green corridors where only certain plants grow. This is why the question, what if the Amazon jungle is hiding ancient megacities, is not really hypothetical anymore. The evidence suggests it is, and always has been. The deeper question is whether we are prepared to see them for what they are, not anomalies, but an entire way of living in balance with one of the most demanding environments on Earth. Historians are still debating whether we should call them cities at all. Some prefer garden urbanism, earthwork complexes, or settlement networks. But these are just words. What matters is that we now know the Amazon's pre-Columbian peoples achieved something extraordinary. A civilization without stone, without wheels, without beasts of burden, yet capable of feeding, housing, and connecting tens of thousands of people across landscapes most outsiders would find uninhabitable. And then, of course, it ended. Disease came, populations fell, the forest reclaimed what was left, but unlike in so many other parts of the world, the reclamation did not destroy. It absorbed. The people disappeared, but their work became part of the living biome, a legacy written in soil and species. In that sense, the Amazon today is not a blank canvas, but a palimpsest, one where the ink of the past still bleeds faintly through the green paint of the present. If you find yourself drifting to sleep as you listen to this, perhaps you can imagine the forest slowly peeling back for you. The leaves thin, the sunlight spills down to the ground, and you stand in the middle of a plaza that hasn't seen a gathering in 500 years. The air is still, but you can almost hear the hum of conversation, the rhythm of a drum. For a moment the city is alive again, and then the curtain falls. So now, as the light fades over the canopy, the Amazon becomes once again what it has been for centuries, a mystery to those outside it, a home to those within it, and a vast archive whose shelves are made of soil and root. We have walked together along the ghost roads, stood in the black earth of vanished gardens, and imagined the life that once filled the plazas. We have seen how the forest can hide a city so well that even its descendants might forget where the streets ran, and how new eyes, guided by lasers and patient archaeology, can begin to read the land again. But the Amazon is not a ruin to be conquered or a puzzle to be solved once and for all. It is a living system, shaped by the hands of those who came before, and still shaped today by the people who live there. Its history is not just in the past, it is underfoot, overhead, and all around, waiting for the right moment to speak. Perhaps that is why its story is so haunting. It refuses to fit neatly into the categories we inherited from other civilizations. It forces us to question what we think we know about cities, about agriculture, about permanence, and it invites us to imagine ways of living where the boundary between human and natural is not a wall, but a conversation. So, as you close your eyes, let the last images blur: a plaza swallowed by trees, a road turned into a root-covered ridge, an orchard that no one planted in living memory yet still fruits on time. Let the green curtain fall again, soft and heavy, until the cities beneath it are just shapes in a dream, and let yourself drift, knowing that somewhere in the deep night of the forest they are still there. Good night,